Hi everyone, it's Marina again. Welcome back to reading Mountains Beyond Mountains with me. So last time we talked about chapter 5. It was more about Dr. Paul Farmer's life experience while he was growing up. He lived with his family on a boat and in trailer parks, and he was still able to succeed academically. Today we'll start with chapter 6. Old college friends describe a boy who made friends easily, legions of them, at least as many females as males, and who had a photographic memory for facts about each one. He'd ask about relatives that I didn't remember I even mentioned to him. If you went to lunch with him at a campus hangout, it could take half an hour to get to a table. He had to stop so often to chat with other people. He liked company when studying, and if you stayed up late with him to do it, you'd feel as though the work came more easily to him than to you. But then he'd start a food fight or make weird close-up images of his face on the copying machine. And later you'd walk back across the silent campus loudly singing songs from The Sound of Music, Raindrops on Roses and Whiskers on Kittens. This is actually one of my favorite movies growing up. After his first semester, Farmer started getting A's. He spent one summer and fall in Paris. He went there with only a little money and no job, and found a Franco-American family that wanted an all par. His mother would send a $5 bill in her weekly letter, and he'd use it to go to plays. On his days off, he went to political demonstrations. "It's Saturday," the man on the house would say to him. "What demonstration did you go today?" He took 4 courses in Paris, among them the last ever taught by the anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss. So infirm by then, he had to be carried up onto the stage. By the time Farmer returned to Duke, he read, wrote, and spoke French fluently. He studied mostly science in his first 2 years of college, and then focused on medical anthropology. He also read widely in subjects not assigned. Many professors were fond of him, and he of them. He wrote his senior honors thesis on gender inequality and depression, no doubt in part because the medical anthropologists he knew were all psychiatrists. But he didn't claim any as a mentor. That distinction went to a German polymath named Rudolf Virchow, dead for the better part of a century. Compared with other historic figures in medicine, such as Pasteur or Schweitzer or Florence Nightingale, Virchow isn't very well known. Only one full-length biography of him exists. Yet he was, as one commentator writes, the principal architect of the foundations of scientific medicine, the first to propose that the basic units of biological life were self-producing, reproducing cells, and that the study of disease should focus on changes in the cell. Virchow made important contributions in oncology and parasitology, coined at least 50 medical terms still in use today, defined the pathophysiology of a host of diseases, including trichinosis, and led a successful campaign for compulsory meat inspection in Germany. He designed a sewage system for Berlin that transformed it from a fetid sty into one of Europe's healthiest cities. He founded a nursing school and hospitals. He was a practicing archaeologist and played an instrumental role in Heinrich Schliemann's excavations of Troy. He helped to define the fields of medical anthropology. He was a physician and a teacher and a practicing politician, so nettlesome in opposition to Germany's imperial ambitions that Bismarck once challenged him to a duel. Virchow published more than 2,000 papers and dozens of books. At Duke, Farmer read some of his work in translation and several articles about him. Virtuo's was a career to stir a brainy youth's imagination, an adventure that combined deeds and intellect, launched at an early age. When he was only 26, the German government sent Virchow to Upper Silesia to report on an epidemic of what was then termed famine fever, now called relapsing fever. Virchow found a region impoverished by absentee landlordism, where the people, mainly Polish, lived principally on potatoes and vodka and suffered from endemic malaria and dysentery. In his report to the German government, he wrote that abysmal social conditions, which the government had fostered and done nothing to relieve, had caused the epidemic. This was 40 years before medical science identified all the biological sources of relapsing fever. Its vector is the louse, but subsequent discoveries would show that Virchow was right. Epidemics of the illness usually occur after social upheavals. In the ensuing overcrowding, poor hygiene, and malnutrition. In his report, Virchow expressed a fundamental law of epidemiology. If disease is an expression of individual life under unfavorable conditions, then epidemics must be indicative of mass disturbances of mass life. Then his prescription for curing Upper Silesia was full and unlimited democracy. This meant, among other things, establishing Polish as the official language, taxing the rich instead of the poor, getting the church out of the business of government, building roads, reopening orphanages, investing in agriculture. The government fired him. Virchow would write, "My politics were those of prophylaxis. My opponents preferred those of palliation." He had a knack for aphorism. Medicine is a social science, and politics is nothing but medicine on a large scale. It is the curse of humanity that it learns to tolerate even the most horrible situations by habituation. Medical education does not exist to provide students with a way of making a living, but to ensure the health of the community. The physicians are the natural attorneys of the poor, and the social problems should largely be solved by them. That last was Farmer's favorite. I agree with a lot of the points he has made in here. Medicine is supposed to be something that promotes social justice. Virchow put the world together in a way that made sense to Farmer. Virchow has a comprehensive vision. He said, "Pathology, social medicine, politics, anthropology, my model." Farmer had acquired, partly through Virchow, a moral understanding of public health. While at Duke, he also found a subject. He was reading very widely in anthropology and history and sociology and political science. He was interested in current events, especially in the violent troubles in Latin America. In 1980s, when Archbishop Oscar Romero was murdered by a right-wing death squad in El Salvador, faculty and students held a protest vigil at the Duke Chapel, and Farmer attended. He also did some reading about the branch of Catholicism called Liberation Theology, which Romero had been murdered for preaching. Latin America theologians had developed a doctrine, and in late 1960s, Latin America's Catholic bishops had endorsed some of its tenets. The bishop who had confirmed the PJ back in Brooksville had delivered a homily mainly about the perils of premarital sex. In the church documents Farmer read now, the Latin American bishops spoke about the oppression of the poor, calling it institutionalized sin. They declared that the church had a duty to provide a preferential option for the poor. Farmer remembered thinking, wow, this ain't the Catholicism I remembered. But he wasn't mainly impelled by politics or religion, he'd say. He felt more curious about the world than outraged. He had the sense that the truth about events in places like El Salvador lay hidden from most Americans, and it was in the same spirit mainly that he got interested in the migrant labor camps not far from Duke. Here I am in the middle of a very affluent university with a lot of comfortable ideas, and I met this nun. She was Belgian, Juliana de Wolf, working with the Friends of the United Farm Workers, and she was a fearless article. I just remember thinking she was much more radical and committed than anyone I had met. Arrogant and humble at the same time. The Haitian farm workers thought the world of her. He met others like her, church ladies, he called them, and he was impressed, not by their piety, but by what they were willing to do on behalf of the migrant workers. They were just so much more militant, if that's the word, than the WLs and academics. They were the ones standing up to the growers in their sensible non-shoes. They were the ones schlepping the workers to the clinics or court, translating for them, getting them groceries or driver's license. In Sister Juliana's company on tours of North Carolina tobacco plantations, he met a number of Haitians. The wretched conditions they lived in made the circumstance of his own childhood seem idyllic. He began reading everything he could find about Haiti. By the time he graduated, he knew enough to write an article of 6,000 words about it. He called it The Haitians Without a Home. At home and abroad, he had come to think. The Haitians were the underdogs of underdogs, the shafted of the shafted. That's very interesting for me to know because, well, we are living our own lives, we don't really think about the other people who are actually suffering that we don't even realize. Farmer left Duke. He graduated summa cum laude, interested in all things Haitian. He visited Crum Detention Center in Florida and joined protests against what seemed to him to rank injustice of an American immigration policy that let in virtually every refugee from Cuba and sent nearly every fleeing Haitian back to hunger and disease, and what had to be the Caribbean's cruelest, most self-serving dictatorship. By now he had certainly progressed, as he would put it, from curiosity to indignation, but curiosity remains. The history of the country seemed worthy of a Homer or a Tolstoy, or especially to Farmer, a Tolkien. The landing of Columbus on the island that he named Hispaniola, and the extermination of the Arawak Indians that followed. The division of the island between France and Spain, which left the French in possession of the island's western third, where they created an immensely lucrative and gruesome slave colony. A third of every new shipment of West African slaves died within 3 years. The slaves' long and bloody revolt, which began in 1791, and which not even Napoleon and 4,000 troops could put down. And at last, in 1804, the creation of Haiti, Latin America's first independent nation and the world's first Black republic. But independence had been followed by nearly 200 years of misrule, aided and abetted by foreign powers, especially the France and the United States. From 1915 to 1935, the U.S. Marine had occupied and ran the country. To Farmer, Haiti's history seemed, indeed, like The Lord of the Rings, an ongoing story of a great and terrible struggle between the rich and the poor, between good and evil. What he read about the country's culture fascinated him. Haiti has its own music and literature. Paintings by Haitian artists hung in European and American museums. The people of Haiti had created their own complex religion, Voodoo, with a rather distant supreme deity and a host of other gods, a pantheon including Catholic saints. It was a system of belief that seemed all the more worth studying because it is so widely misunderstood and ridiculed, and the Haitian tongue, Creole, was not, as was sometimes said, a coarse patois, but in essence a Romance language, derived from French, and in some of its phonetic habits and grammatical structures, also certainly African. It was unique to Haiti, lovely and expressive, and born of grim necessity. The French masters had deliberately separated slaves who spoke the same languages, and the slaves had fashioned their own tongue. Farmer began to study Creole before he went to Haiti in the spring of 1983. He planned to spend about a year there. He had won a prize of $1,000 at Duke for an essay about Haitian artists, and he figured that this should last him, since he read that the average Haitian lived on far less. He had worked as a volunteer in an emergency room at Duke's University Hospital and had begun applying to two schools, Harvard and Case Western Reserve, where one could get a joint degree as a doctor anthropologist. He figured he'd find out if that's what he really wanted to become by trying out both disciplines in Haiti. In 1983, when Farmer landed in Port-au-Prince, the airport was still named Francois Duvalier, in honor of the infamous Papa Doc, who had run the country with liberal use of terror from 1957 until his death in 1971. His reign was being continued now in the person of his son, Baby Doc, a little less crafty than his father, but with the same proclivity for murdering political enemies and for stealing and misappropriating foreign aid. He would soon proclaim himself president for life. In fact, the Duvaliers' 3 decades in power were nearly up, but no one knew that then. The Haiti that Farmer first encountered ranked as an exotic destination for tourists, including sex tourists. Haitians are comely people, the majority desperately poor. One international guide for gay tourists reported in 1983, "Your partners will expect to be paid for their service, but the charges are nominal." Port-au-Prince was a city full of slums, but it also had a few fancy neighborhoods and some good restaurants and hotels, and it was very safe for tourists, patrolled by, among others, the Duvaliers' Praetorian Guard, the men in dark glasses. They didn't harass tourists, not unless they looked in a suitcase and found a copy of Graham Greene's Mordaunt, anti-Duvalierist novel of Haiti, The Comedians. Even then, they'd merely administer a harangue. Farmer didn't bring his copy of the novel, and he didn't hang around in the city at first. During a brief postgraduate fellowship at the University of Pittsburgh, he had met a member of the Mellon family. They had used part of their fortune to build a hospital in Haiti, the Hospital Albert Schweitzer, situated in the town of Deschapelles, in the lower Artibonite Valley. Farmer journeyed out there from Port-au-Prince almost as soon as he had arrived. He had high expectations, and it was a good-looking hospital, he thought, but it was staffed mainly by white expatriate doctors. He had imagined something different, a hospital at least partly devoted to training Haitians to treat Haitians. Besides, the Schweitzer didn't have a job for him just then, in spite of his melon contract. He went back to the city feeling, he said, deflated. He began looking around for other situations. He came across a small charity called I Care Haiti, with headquarters in Port-au-Prince. It conducted mobile outreach clinics in the countryside and kept a small house as a base for those operations out in the Central Plateau. In the town of Mirabellis, Farmer headed there. So now we're going to chapter 7. Years later, Paul Farmer received this letter from a woman he wanted to marry. Lovely pal, my inability to promise a life with you as your wife does not seem to stem from a lack of love or deep commitment to you. Indeed, as you probably know, I have not felt a serious ounce of for anyone but you since 1983. My decision was based instead on trying to envision our life together, and I saw us not matching, the only way we didn't fit. For a long time, I thought I could live and work in Haiti, carving out a life with you. But now I understand that I can't, and that's simply not compatible with your life, the life you once told me you would like to lead even 10 years ago. You pointed out to me once, during an emotional argument, that the qualities I love in you, that drew me to you, also caused me to resent you. Namely, your unswerving commitment to the poor, your limitless schedule, and your massive compassion for others. You were right, and as your wife, I would place my own emotional needs in the way of your important vision, a vision whose impact upon the poor and the rest of us can't be exaggerated. I was lucky to meet you when I was young enough to feel as though I have always known you, and lucky to have been hugely influenced and loved by you. In the end, I hope you know that as part of my histology you can never be replaced. Her name was Ophelia Dow. She came from Buckinghamshire in England. She had traveled to Haiti in January 1983 in order to please her father with the intention, rather vague, of doing good works. She was 18, a slightly mature 18, she would say, and was working as a volunteer for I Care Haiti. She was staying for a week at the I Care house in Mirabellis. Back then, Mirabellis was the country home of Madame Max Adolphi, formerly the warden of Fort de Manche, where the Duvaliers sent their enemies, a prison likened by one historian to Buchenwald. Madame Max was now the national chief of the Tontos Macoutes, so Mirabellis was a place of some significance, different from most of those little towns scattered through the mountains and valleys farther north, in that it had intermittent electricity and radios, playing at most hours. A small section of paved road at its center, ramshackle kiosk-like stores beside the road, and a few places where you could buy a beer or a glass of the potent white rum called Clarin. It also had a teleco, a building near the center of its own. Where you could, with great difficulty, get connected by phone to Port-au-Prince or Brooklyn or even Buckinghamshire. Ophelia had wanted urgently to call home. A letter from her father had mentioned new troubles there, and she felt irrationally and keenly responsible for heading them off. She had gone into the telephone, trying to think of the right things to say to her father. Her call didn't go through. It was raining when she stepped outside, feeling glum. The rain had driven everyone else indoors. In fair weather, children would crowd around Ophelia, and people would call out, "Glen, Glen," as she passed, not intending rudeness, she had learned, but merely announcing the presence of an unusual sight. Here in Haiti provinces, it was of course her white skin that made her stand out, but certainly she was a lovely young woman. In the midday heat of Haiti, her face would grow red blotches, but at normal temperature her skin had a lovely clarity. Trudging moodily back to the eye-care house in the warm rain, Ophelia looked up and, to her great surprise, saw a young white man standing on the building's balcony, a pale and rangy fellow she would remember. She had been living among Haitians for months, eating their kind of food and beginning to speak their language. And she took some pride in the fact that she wasn't merely a tourist. She felt annoyed. Who was this Bland on the balcony? What was he doing here on her turf? So she did what any well-bred English girl would do. She went outside and introduced herself to him. The house had a common room with a cement floor, some wooden chairs, and a table. She and Paul sat down on either side of it and began to talk. Within minutes, she'd remembered, she had sensed that for the first time in months, she didn't have to hold herself back, not even the part of her that she thought of as slightly outrageous, the part that liked bawdy humor and cussing. Before long, she was telling this stranger about her aborted phone call and the hand-wrangling feeling that it left her with. Trouble at home and her far away. She told him, "I want to write a nice letter to my father." Paul smiled at her. "You should start with, 'Dearest and indeed only Dad.'" She laughed. At some point, Paul said, "Tell me about your family." Many years later, a friend of hers would offer this recipe for seduction. Go out to dinner and say, "Tell me about your life." Ophelia would think of Paul and how, when he said those words, he made so many people feel that he cared about them, only at that moment. He only cared about them at that moment, sorry. Of course, one knew that sometimes his interest was mixed with other motives, but he had this power because somehow one also knew that his interest was sincere. She told him about her movie star mother, Patricia Neal, and all the family tragedies. Her mother's well-publicized cerebral hemorrhage and long convalescence, and currently well-publicized angry breakup with Ophelia's father, the writer Ronald Dell. He was the one who sent her to Haiti, in fact, by grousing that she should do something adventurous and useful. He worried that she lacked ambition. During her last 2 years of secondary school, she had studied geography, but before she had boarded the plane to Port-au-Prince, she had to consult an atlas to find out where Haiti was. She had a lot of pent-up thoughts and no one to tell them to, and now she did. Maybe any English-speaking stranger would have served the purpose, but this young man seemed close to ideal. She poured out her family story, her sadness, her present worries, and Paul listened intently, never saying she shouldn't feel as she did, but only now and then suggesting ways she might accommodate her feelings. She was amazed. Here was this 23-year-old American who looked as though he was still molting adolescence, handsome enough but too pale and gangly and boyish looking to be called dishy. And she thought, how does he know what to say to me that would be comforting? I've heard that listening is one of the best social skills you can have because everyone wants to talk, but not everyone can sit down and listen to people and have that patience. So, yeah, I think Dr. Farmer was using his skills as a good listener to win people's trust. She liked the way Paul responded to her near celebrity. She didn't sense he was thinking, I'm talking to a movie star's daughter. He just seems amused by the circumstance. He told her a little bit about his own family and a few of the other stories of his childhood, and these made her laugh. She gathered that he had come out to Mirabilis to see if he wanted to join up with iCare, so she described the various personalities of the team. She wouldn't have liked him half so much if he hadn't said, Thank you for telling me that, with such evident feeling, with his eyes opened wide. They talked until about 3 in the morning. For the next few days, he went out with the team in its Land Rover. He had told her that he was in Haiti mainly to do anthropology. She wasn't quite sure what that meant. He had a tape recorder and a camera and a notebook, and seated beside him, she watched him do his own watching from the truck. As they bumped along the dusty roads past the miserable peasant huts, she asked him questions. Why were so many people sick? Why weren't the roads better? He would answer her, but warily at first, as if he was waiting to be sure who she was. He was embarrassingly enthusiastic, though. When people by the roadside called out "Blan Blan," he would call back "Hi," and grin and make floppy wristed waves. Once you were no longer a tourist, you didn't wave, she thought. Waving at your own brothers, she said. Farmer turned to her. What's that supposed to mean? He was trying to smile. Looking at him, she thought, he is innocent about meanness. He's the sort of person who didn't feel compelled to tell you all his thoughts, but she sensed that if he did tell you some, if he let you in, and you made fun of him, it would be a long time before he'd open up again. For the first time in months, she was in the company of someone she could have fun with, and she had blown it. I'm sorry, I didn't mean it. He smiled at her, and the next time someone called Blen, he waved just as before. She felt forgiven. He did other nerdy things, like telling her the Latin names of trees and shrubs. He wasn't shy at all. He seemed able to talk to anyone, but was clearly most interested in talking to the peasants, who were, he explained, the vast majority of Haitians, even in the urban slums. He took photographs. He made notes about the hospitals they visited. He asked peasants many questions. Where did they get their drinking water? What did they think caused illnesses? He recorded the conversations and transcribed them at night back at the iCare house. He was mastering Creole with enviable speed. She had been in Haiti for months, and he had only recently arrived. Yet by the end of their week of travel, he had surpassed her. He could almost, in the Haitian phrase, speak Creole like a rat. At the end of that week in the countryside, the iCare team headed back toward Port-au-Prince. She and Paul sat together in the back seat for the long drive. By now, he was calling her by the nickname that her family has given her, Min. He was regaling her with the myriad nicknames in his own family as they neared the steep, narrow part of National Highway 3 that scales down Mont Cabrit, Goat Mountain, toward Cul-de-Sac Plain. The rover began turning a corner beside the cliff, and they were thrown to one side together. And then up ahead they saw a carpet of mangoes spread across the road. Children dashed around, gathering up the fruit. A little further on, a small, battered pickup truck lay on the side. Obviously, The tap-tap had been top-heavy with passengers and fruit, heading for market. Obviously, it had exhausted shock absorbers and back brakes. Overturned baskets and mangoes were strewn all around. The passengers were market people, in head wraps, some sitting by the road looking dazed, others standing around talking heatedly. One woman lay near the truck, her body surrounded by mangoes, only partly covered with a cardboard. There was a policeman at the scene. He told them cheerfully, 3 gold-framed teeth gleaming, that yes, the woman had died. There was nothing to be done. For Ophelia, the scene behind them would become a fixture in her memories, like her first scent of Haiti, the acidic, garbagey smell that had hit her when she first arrived at the Franco's Duvalier airport. She looked over at Paul as they drove on toward the city. He was staring out the window. He had become, she would remember, very, very silent. They didn't become lovers that spring, but they saw each other almost every day over the next month or so, sometimes on iCare's outreach expeditions, more often in Port-au-Prince. When they were both in the city, she would walk over to his place after work. He lived in an old ruin of mansion, covered with balconies and wooden fretwork, and set in a garbage-strewn lot. It belonged to an art dealer. The wife of a previous owner, so the story went, had gone into labor one night during a period when Baby Doc had imposed a curfew on the city, and the husband had run out to get help and got shot dead on the street. The house was huge and empty, except for Pa and one other tenant, a Haitian woman, who would sometimes cook meals out in the courtyard, the smell of burning charcoal rising into Paul's windows. His room was on the 2nd floor. It had many windows with old, elaborate wooden shutters opening onto balconies. Through the windows you could see a large part of the city and the waterfront, and off to one side the tents and the cardboard huts in a slum called La Saline. She often found him up in his room writing. He had composed a poem called The Mango Lady, dedicated to Ophelia. He read it out loud. The 3rd verse began. We start, eyes drawn reluctantly back, over baskets to the dead mango lady. Stretched stiff on her bier of tropical fruit, she is almost covered by a cardboard strip, like the flag of her corrugated country, a flimsy strip too thin to hide the wounds. No doubt being far from home simplified their courtship, so that it didn't even seem like one. When they were out, she paid the way. She had money. He didn't have much. It seemed only sensible and natural that she share hers, and he shared his superior knowledge of Haiti. He told her about Madame Max, for example, teasing her, explaining that the iCare house sat on Madame Max's land, so that, in effect, Ophelia was working for the Tontos Macutes. One time she said to him, I met this interesting guy at Olofsen. He said he is the model for Petite Pierre in Graham Greene's book, The Comedians. Paul explained that this was true, and that the clownish little man she had met was a Duvalierist informant. Paul was educating her, she felt, though not deliberately. Usually she asked the questions. Often a little artfulness was needed. If he made a cryptic or broad statement, it was best not to challenge him, because then he might grow reticent. Better to say, tell me more. Up in his room in the haunted house, she initiated many talks, our long, windy discussions, she'd say years later. But what is anthropology exactly? He told her, in effect, I'm using words he would put in print. in an article about a year and a half later that anthropology concerned itself less with measurements than with meaning, as in mastering a language, one had to learn not just the literal meanings of words, but also their connotations. And to grasp those, one had to know the politics and economic systems and history of a place. Only then could you really understand an event like the Mango Lady's death. In the article he wrote the following year, Farmer would use phrases such as highly reticulated relations among disease, nutritional status, socioeconomic factors, and health and illness beliefs and practices. As a rule, he didn't speak much more plainly about subjects like the Mango Lady, but Ophelia made her own translations. Accidents happen, sure, but not every bad thing that happens is an accident. There was nothing accidental about the wretchedness of the road down Morne Cabrit, or the overloaded tap-tap, or the desperation of a peasant woman who had to get to the market and make a sale because otherwise her family would go hungry. These circumstances all had causes, and the nearest ones were the continuing misrule of the Duvaliers and the long-standing American habit of lavishing aid on dictators such as Baby Doc, who used the money to keep himself and the Haitian elite in luxury and power, and spent almost nothing on things like roads and transportations. Wow, this is so insightful. Before she had met Paul, Haiti had seemed merely vivid, terrible and strange. The worm a full foot long that she had seen wriggling out of baby's anus in the hospital where she first worked. The numberless children with diarrheal diseases, the daily national anthem ceremony in front of the presidential palace, where by decree everyone had to stop and face the teeny music or suffer the wrath of the Macutes. Now she had someone to translate Haiti to her. In the process, Paul laid out a comprehensive theory of poverty, of a world designed by the elites of all the nations to serve their own ends. The pieces of the design enshrined in ideologies, which erased the histories of how things came as they were, and he knew the details for Haiti, a catastrophe covered by the fingerprints of the Western powers, most of those of France and the United States. I never knew that Haiti's poverty is to some degree caused by wealthy European countries. This is something new for me. Ophelia gazed out the window of Paul's room in the mansion as he read his latest poem to her. Poverty was his subject, she thought, and the windows of the haunted house were his observation post. He was looking for a better one. His plans weren't clear, but his aims seemed to be. He'd come here to do ethnography, the kind of anthropology he most admired, learning about a culture, not through books and artifacts, but from the people who had inherited and were making culture. His special field was going to be medical ethnography. He wanted to learn everything about morbidity and mortality in the most disease-ridden country in the hemisphere. He'd write about what he's discovered in this way, he told her, lend a voice to the voiceless. He'd also become a doctor. He wasn't sure which branch of medicine he'd choose, maybe psychiatry. In any case, he'd be a doctor for poor people. Maybe he'd end up working in Africa or an American inner city. Drawing him out, Ophelia felt both enthralled and disturbed. During one of their long talks in his room, she found herself thinking, "Oh dear, oh good, my life has changed." Years later, she would tell me, "I think there's a point where you realize The world has just been revealed to you. It's like realizing your parents are both good and bad. It's sort of, oh no, things will never be quite the same again. She was, after all, very young. A person 5 years older could be a credible mentor, though now and then he'd say something that reminded her he wasn't very old himself. Before she left Haiti later that spring, she told him she was going home to do pre-medical studies. She was going to be a doctor too. Good, he said earnestly. He had finished his own pre-med work. You know what you should do? Make flashcards. They promised to write. I actually make a lot of flashcards for my college classes. Paul had asked Ophelia to call his parents when she got home, but he neglected to tell her that the warden, still very much alive in 1983, had a rule that his daughters call home every night before they drove back to the Star Road State Prison from their after-school jobs in Brooksville. And Farmer also hadn't told her that his sister Peggy had lately affected a convincing English accent. She made the call. Hello, Mr. Farmer. My name is Ophelia and I just came from Haiti. I was with Paul and he sends his love, and he wants you to know that he's all right. Yeah. All right, Peggy, knock it off. No, my name is Ophelia and I was just with Paul. Ophelia, Peggy, get on home, said the warden and hung up. Ophelia called back and managed to convince him eventually. The warden apologized. She could hear laughter in the background. Ophelia had left Paul several contemporary novels. By the time she got to England, a letter had arrived, a book report of sorts. The entire novel is more fun if you've read Dante's Inferno, Joyce's Ulysses, the chapter in which Bloom brings Molly breakfast in bed, Homer, Proust, and The Maids, a play by Janet. At the end, he had written, P.S. You are a slut for leaving me here alone. Increasingly ardent requests for a letter followed. You trollop, you, why haven't you displaced any passenger pigeons in my direction? If she didn't write tout de suite, he'd lock her in a broom closet with a rather unattractive mutual acquaintance of theirs, giving both of them potent aphrodisiacs, and take away the laveries. For a time she didn't write him back. She wasn't sure why. Maybe she was just being lazy. She still intended to become a doctor, and she hated to think that she might never see him again. Soon after she got back from Europe, her father took her to lunch with Graham Greene, who Paul had said was one of his favorite writers. The elderly novelist, tall and stooped, seemed genuinely glad for news of Haiti, especially of the egregious Petite Pierre. He inscribed her copy of The Comedians to Ophelia, who knew the real Haiti. If he really thought of her, she wondered, what would he have made of Paul Farmer? And that's the end of chapter 7. So it's interesting to get on the spin of a love story. Well, Paul Farmer was trying to become a doctor and an anthropologist. So thanks for being with me, and we'll start with chapter 8 next time.